Hello, and welcome to another episode of You Are Not Your Diagnosis. Today's episode will be another guest interview, and my guest today is going to be Mahar Barnett. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about her. Mahar works as a functional nutritionist using her in-depth understanding of physiology and nutrition to create biochemically tailored nutrition plans that optimize her clients' health. Instead of using mainstream dietary advice, comprehensive laboratory testing and health history serve as a guide for building individualized nutritional therapies to support peak health. Mahar holds a Bachelor of Science in Dietetics from Kansas State University, a master's degree in Nutrition and Functional Medicine from University of Western States in Portland, and she also holds certifications in mindful eating from the University of California, San Diego. She's also trained in teaching Vinyasa yoga. I'm really excited to chat with Mahar. We met a couple of weeks ago and really connected, really share a very similar philosophy, but I'm really wanting to share a little bit more about nutrition because that is not my area of expertise or training, but I truly believe that it's very important for our health, especially for those of us dealing with chronic health issues. So without further ado, here is the interview with Mahar Barnett. So welcome to the show, Mahar. I'm really excited to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I know from our conversation a few weeks ago when we met that you have your own story with chronic illness. So I'd love to just start there so that our listeners know a little bit about you and kind of your experience.
Sure. Looking back, I'm not sure I ever felt fabulous, but it was about 10 years ago after both of my kids were born that I started to feel waves of pretty significant fatigue and pain, joint pain. And that went on for a few years without any diagnosis. I ended up finally seeing a rheumatologist. But prior to seeing the rheumatologist, a good friend of mine said, hey, why don't you think about removing some inflammatory foods? I had gone back to school at the time. I was in a bachelor's program. I had not decided to go into nutrition yet. I was actually still trying to figure that out. And after seeing her, she identified some foods through testing that she thought were impacting how I was feeling. And I removed them. By the time I saw the rheumatologist, my symptoms were gone. And so I was already, my interest in nutrition was already peaked a bit just from having parents that paid close attention to it as a child, but that drove my desire to go down the path of nutrition and functional nutrition. I continued to play with the nutritional factors in my life and nutritional supplementation and have since been fairly well controlled without any kind of medical intervention with my autoimmune condition, which is scleroderma. So in general, if I stick with what I know to be best in my body, I feel really good. And that is how I now work with people.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was going to say, did that lead to the work you do? And you definitely answered that. And that kind of, it seemed like you were interested in nutrition before, but then having this experience of how it helped you kind of pushed you down that path for sure.
Yeah, it was my undergrad work was in dietetics, and it was a great foundation of science and understanding nutrition science, but it was not an education that used food as medicine. And so when I completed that bachelor's degree, I pursued a master's in functional medicine because it would give me the power to use it to shift people's biochemistry. And so that's why I ended up going that direction instead of going into the dietetics internship that is the traditional route.
Well, tell our listeners a little bit about functional nutrition for those of them who might not know what exactly that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So functional nutrition is a spinoff of functional medicine. Functional medicine aims to identify the root dysfunction or root imbalances that are biochemically shifting the body or physiologically shifting the body towards disease or symptoms. And instead of symptom management, we are looking to shift the underlying mechanisms so the symptoms go away on their own, and therefore improving the whole health of the body versus just trying to decrease blood pressure or trying to impact blood sugar, et cetera, et cetera. I use nutrition as the tool to impact those imbalances, whereas maybe a functional medicine practitioner will always use nutrition. It's a foundation of how we work, but they have other tools as well that they may be using. I stick to the nutrition and supplementation.
Wonderful. Yeah, food was definitely our first medicine, right? So why not go back to that as a foundational piece of our health?
Absolutely. We literally are what we eat. So
exactly. It makes up our bodies. And I think it's gotten forgotten by many kind of perspectives. I know I was shocked when I heard someone say that, doctors really only study nutrition for maybe like a week in their education.
Typically it is an elective. They can elect to take the class or not. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you think of how important it is for our health, that just baffled me when I heard that. So
it is. And it's interesting. I think from the perspective that we often think of nutrition as macronutrients and a series of micronutrients, right? It's protein and fats and carbohydrates and it's minerals and it's vitamins. But I think one of the facets we really ignore right now is that food can be medicine, but food can also be an assault or an insult to our body on a daily basis. And if our food is doing harm, that is exactly the opposite of what we want to be doing in medicine. We do not want our food to be the illness or the injury to our system. So we have to identify what those foods are individually for each person. That's different. And then supply the body with what it needs with the macronutrients and the micronutrients.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. And it kind of leads into my next question, which is, why do you think nutrition is so integral, especially for people with chronic health issues?
Yeah, and it does really speak to that individuality of the foods that are harmful to us. And I think that is, although I learned the general concepts while I was doing my graduate degree, being in clinical practice has underscored that time and time again. It's really fascinating how you can move a group of people to a whole food diet, right? You take the junk food out, you take the processed food out. That's kind of a no-brainer. We know we need to get those harmful foods out. But for one person, we might see that their body tolerates and thrives on rice or oats, and another body absolutely cannot tolerate it. It actually becomes harmful. And so it is, I'm sure, a combination of our genetics. It's a combination of how we've eaten throughout our life. So our microbiome and our immune system is modeled based on what we're eating and what our exposures are to illness and other environmental factors. And over all these years and all these exposures with our unique genetics, we each have a list of foods that really are harmful and foods that really are healing. And identifying those is the magic to using food as medicine.
Yeah. I know I hear that question from people, or I've seen that posted a lot in different groups where it's like, well, what diet is best for autoimmune disease? And it sounds like from your perspective, it's not a straightforward answer of, do, an autoimmune paleo diet or do this. It's very, very unique.
Yeah, I wish it was that easy. And I think that moving to an autoimmune diet or a paleo diet for a lot of people with autoimmunity is enough of a relief on their system that they get really great results right off the bat. And that's enough motivation to keep going, because it can be a difficult change to move to these more restrictive diets, but it's motivating when you feel good. I haven't seen that long term that's always the most effective way to go, because eventually we want diversity in the diet. We don't want people to have to be limited to specific foods for the rest of their life. It is going to impact their micronutrient balance. We want them to have diversity and freedom. Sometimes if you can find the specific foods that are affecting them, then you can rebuild their diet and continue to bring foods back in as their body heals, especially as the immune system becomes more appropriately sensitive.
That's really interesting, because I think that's one of the biggest things that I've heard people say is, it's so restrictive. How will I deal with this for the rest of my life? And that's kind of like the resistance of that's a big change, and that's a lot of restriction to think of forever. So it's interesting to think of how, we can figure out through like the work that you do, what specifically are the culprits that are kind of most problematic for each individual.
Yeah, it is powerful.
Cool. So what sort of positive changes have you seen through people changing their diets? I know you shared a little bit about your own experience before you even knew exactly what was going on with your health, but what have you seen? What are some case studies?
It's vast and varied. Just this morning I had a text message from a mom, a friend of mine whose daughter used to dance with my daughter, and she reached out to me over the summer and said, something is just so off with my daughter. She's inflamed, she's in pain, she's gaining weight. It doesn't make any sense. It's not normal weight. It's bloating and puffiness, and she dances 12 hours a week. It just doesn't make any sense. And we did a panel and identified her food sensitivities. And based on that, we created a diet that eliminated those food sensitivities without being terribly restrictive for an 11-year-old. That's challenging.
It's very challenging.
And put her on a supplement protocol. And the little girl was very motivated, I have to say that. So she dove in and she did make all the changes. And the text message I got this morning was she has turned completely around. The bloating is gone. The inflammation is gone. The pain is gone. The fatigue is gone. She's active and alert and resolved and committed because she feels so much better. And around the same time, my daughter was having similar issues. So we actually got them together to cook together, and they had some similar food sensitivities. And I've seen the same result in my daughter. Most of the people I work with are much older. They're further down the disease pathway. And that said, I have a great story of a gentleman I'm working with right now who's 40, active, 2 kids that he's very involved with just outside of his normal work schedule, but he's suffered from psoriatic arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis for over 20 years. He's been in chronic pain, and he's been diagnosed and put on multiple medications. In a case like that, you typically see a lot of food sensitivities. The gastrointestinal tract and the immune response within the gastrointestinal tract is hyper responsive. And so it's tough. You'll see 30 or 40 foods that you're having to take out of a diet.
Wow.
So we implemented some of those changes about 8 weeks ago. And he reached out to me quite a few times saying, wow, this is restrictive. Wow, this is restrictive. And I said, I know, just give it 30 days. We're going to add things back in. Let's see. And we spoke 30 days later, and he said, my symptoms are gone.
Wow.
For the first time in 20 years, I don't have gastrointestinal distress. I'm not off my medication, but I'm curious to see if I'm going to be able to do that. My energy's up. I'm 12 pounds down just of inflammation and that bloated, painful holding that we have when we're really inflamed. And we were able, after the first 30 days, to start bringing other foods back in, and he was able to tolerate it. And we've expanded what he's eating. He's still doing extremely well. So inflammatory conditions and inflammatory responses, which is the immune system's response to illness or injury, I see those resolve fairly quickly in most people. And when they don't resolve right off the bat, we've missed something and we keep digging.
That's so cool. I know one of the things that you and I chatted about when we met was just this perspective of Western medicine about, chronic illness that we, both kind of don't resonate with, because we've seen just through, different tools that we use, but we've seen such profound healing for people that it's not just kind of that perspective of, this is as good as it's going to get, or it's going to progress. Like, that's an incredible story of someone who, in pain for 20 years, and now his life, I'm sure he has his life back.
Yeah. And it's common. I see that it almost becomes normal to me, because this is what I see with almost everybody I work with. People don't typically work with me when they feel great. They work with me when they don't feel great, when they're managing chronic disease. There are tricky situations for sure, and not everybody responds that quickly and that easily, but we tend to get to the bottom of it eventually. We tend to figure out metabolically what is imbalanced and fix it.
That's so cool. Yeah. Yeah, I had somebody once say to me, you don't know what it's like not to have inflammation until you don't have
Yeah,
inflammation.
it's really true.
And I
It's
thought
really
that was
true.
really fascinating because I think a lot of times, people are walking around and they're kind of achy and uncomfortable. And then if you have chronic illness, that's just how you feel all the time. And once you clear a lot of that inflammation out of your body, it's like, wow, I haven't felt this good in, a very long time.
It's so true. It's so true. I have people fill out a symptom survey where they score, maybe 50 different symptoms from a 1 to a 4, because it's really critical for them to be able to see that objective comparison a month later or 2 months later, because it's hard to remember how you felt when your norm is feeling brain fog and upset stomach or bloating or pain.
Yes.
It's just, 8 weeks later you go, oh my gosh, look at all the symptoms I had.
Right. Yeah. That's always fascinating too.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you ask a client, well, how's this particular symptom? They go, what? I
Ah,
don't remember having that.
yeah.
So it's kind of nice to have that documented so people can
Mhm.
actually see the true progress that they've made. Because
It is.
it's amazing how we can forget about something that was so prevalent in our lives and now it's gone.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. It's fun to be able to have that comparison.
Cool. Well, tell us a little bit about blood sugar. I know we were chatting a little bit about this when we met, but what role does blood sugar play in all of this work that you do?
This has been one of the most intriguing and fascinating newer realizations I've had over the last year or so. I had the opportunity to ghostwrite a book for a doctor on blood sugar, and it was through that process that I learned that everybody has a different response to different foods. It's not, and it has often nothing to do with the carbohydrate load. That is so contrary to what we learn, even in functional medicine. This is, your listeners will start to hear this more and more often. It's all of a sudden the light bulbs going off in the functional medicine world, especially when we're going, oh my gosh, glycemic load, glycemic index, glycemic response, all these things are different than what we thought. So what I found is, anytime your blood sugar moves out of the sweet spot, the zone that we like to have our blood sugar in between about 80 and 110, there's an inflammatory response. And if your body can't regulate blood sugar and you are swinging too high and too low in response to your meals, you're going to stay in a state of inflammation pretty much all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the person's underlying biochemistry, they may struggle to metabolize the food that they're eating and control that blood sugar response based on how many carbohydrates or sugars are in the food.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the time I see especially in women over the age of 40, challenge regulating their blood sugar between meals. So staying in a zone that their body has enough fuel to metabolize without dipping too low. And if they dip too low, they'll have a cortisol response, a stress response, because it's dangerous to go too low. And then the cortisol will trigger the liver to release stored sugar and they'll get a blood sugar spike. So often we're seeing this happening between meals, not even as a response to the meal.
Interesting.
And the other time that I see that regularly is overnight. So I'll see people that really balance their blood sugar beautifully with their diet during the day, but they can't regulate the lack of food for 12 hours or so. And so they'll swing up and down, up and down. They'll wake up with high blood sugar readings. They haven't eaten anything for 12 hours.
Yeah, which
so
you would think that would be the case then, because you haven't eaten anything for 12 hours.
Exactly. And it gives us a lot of valuable data. We'll see that happen with sleep apnea because there's a stress response happening all night as oxygen is deprived. And we'll also see it in people that can't digest fat very well. So their body's overly dependent on carbohydrates. It can't flip into using fat for fuel appropriately. And the other fascinating aspect of this is food sensitivities or foods that you're reacting to will cause a stress response that will cause a blood sugar spike. And so I have had people spike from eggs, from chicken, from broccoli, from other foods that have so little carbohydrate or no carbohydrate that it is not logical that we would have a blood sugar spike. So the way that this plays into how I work with people is if there's a suspicion that blood sugar regulation is adding to the inflammatory response in their body, we do very thorough tracking of that with a glucometer, taking blood sugar multiple times a day. And we are looking for those patterns. How much fiber do you need? What foods are specifically triggering a blood sugar response to you? What sugars can you process? Can you do maple syrup, but you can't do honey? Can you do oats, but you can't do rice, et cetera, et cetera? And this is back to the individuality. Everybody is different. And when we can identify the diet, the meals, the timing of the meals that works well to keep the body between that 80 and 110. And I should say it's important to know that's 110 1 hour after eating. We don't expect blood sugar to stay under 110 after the meal, but it should be back down to that level 1 hour after eating. Inflammation load just drops and people start to feel a lot better. Their energy goes up, their clarity goes up, their weight goes down, they just feel buoyant in their body and much better.
Interesting. And why do you think there is that loss of ability to like regulate blood sugar? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors to it. And I think about this a lot. There are environmental toxins that we know affect our insulin response. I think that's a bigger factor than we want to acknowledge right now. Endocrine disruptors, insulin is a hormone and cortisol is a hormone, just like estrogen and testosterone and progesterone and thyroid and on, yes. List all the hormones. Hormone disruptors are affecting our blood sugar response for sure. There is a critical time in a female's life when we go through menopause and our estrogen decreases and our cortisol goes up. And anytime cortisol is elevated consistently, you're going to have some blood sugar response because it affects our blood sugar management and our insulin. So I think those are factors. One of the other things we know is that if your body is in a state of inflammation for any reason, whether that's underlying infection, poor diet, chronic stress. So I just need to emphasize that chronic stress, trauma. We know that the inflammatory molecules that our immune system pumps out can damage the receptors for insulin on the surface of the cell. And over time, if enough of those insulin receptors are damaged, then while we may be eating carbohydrates and then releasing insulin from the pancreas, we have lost the ability to use that glucose for fuel, those carbohydrates for fuel. So I think the combination of all of the things our body is trying to manage right now between overloaded schedules and, go down the list of all the things that cause stressors on top of environmental stressors and toxins on top of poor diet and poor sleep, et cetera, has caused a perfect storm for this. Because I see it in, I'd say 80% of the people that I work with, there's a blood sugar dysregulation. Does not mean diabetes. Sort of sometimes means insulin resistance, but not always. And it's important to know that in the great majority of these people, their hemoglobin A1C, which is traditionally what we rely on to diagnose an issue with blood sugar, is totally normal.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So if you were just going to a doctor and having your standard test done to make sure you're not, having problems with that, then it would look normal, but you would be having these kind of underlying
gives
swings.
Us no data. And, I'll share a personal story with this. My hemoglobin A1C is at about 4.9. That like any doctor is going to, give me a high five for that. Perfect blood sugar, even low blood sugar.
Right.
Because I have a very high response to mold, and therefore I have a high response to foods that contain mold, which note rice is one of those foods.
Interesting.
A quarter cup of rice will spike my blood sugar to almost 200.
Wow.
A half of an apple, not a moldy food, interestingly, will spike my blood sugar to almost 200. I do not have diabetes, but I definitely, due to probably my autoimmune condition and years of chronic stress and that damage, have an insulin resistance issue. So I manage my nutrition to stay within those numbers very carefully.
Yeah. It sounds really important. And that's something like before this conversation that you and I had a few weeks ago, I was like, wow, I had no idea of that particular aspect of it. So it'll be interesting to see over the next few years as that becomes kind of more understood and more well known about, how that gets addressed for people.
It is. And that we have a trend right now. We always have a lot of nutritional fads, right? And there's typically a scientific basis to these things, and then they get blown out of proportion. So right now we're in the world of ketogenic diets and
Right.
intermittent fasting.
Mm-hmm.
And for a subset of the population, that can be wonderfully therapeutic, and it can be the right call. But take a woman that can't digest fat and is perimenopausal and is having a cortisol level that's increasing and has decided to eat only between an 8-hour window. This is the perfect storm for a metabolic disaster. She doesn't have enough fuel to fuel between meals. She's limiting her carbohydrate intake, but her body can't use fat instead. And she's spending 16 hours a day, let's say, not eating. Her blood sugar levels typically are going to swing so wildly overnight that she's actually driving herself to poor sleep regulation and mood disorders and poor energy and weight gain. So those are people that I have them eat when they first wake up in the morning, then eat every 3 hours. They have a bit of carbohydrates and a bunch of fiber at each meal, and they eat right before they go to bed. They have to. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden they get better. Their body drops weight. They're eating more than they were eating before, right? And they're like terrified of carbs. No, not the awful carb. And I'm like, guys, your body is going to be really happy if it doesn't feel scared all the time. And I think that's something that is important for us to acknowledge, is that we have fight or flight and we have rest and digest. Mm-hmm. If your body doesn't have a source of fuel, if it has lost the ability to fuel itself between meals or even with the food you're giving it, it's in a state of fight or flight. And when it's in a state of fight or flight, it stores fat because that's a survival technique.
Yep. Yeah, as I've kind of studied more about metabolism over the past year, it's fascinating, how many complexities to the system that our body have because of the years of, when we just lived off the land and we didn't have a lot of surplus. So our body is like very geared to make sure we're not going to starve.
It's true. It's relatively new to us as a species to have access to food all the time, and highly calorically dense food all the time, right?
Right. Not just, having something you picked from a little garden that you might have scraped together, or a little bit of meat that you happen to manage to, hunt down.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think of that complexity. And then, we're actually working against it with a lot of these fad diets, or thinking that, oh, this is the way to go. And if your body doesn't respond well to that particular thing, because it's not how your body can process.
Exactly. And that, goes back to, again, the individuality of our bodies and answering those individual needs versus what we think is best. We do a lot of arguing with ourselves over what feels right, and then what we are telling ourselves is right.
It's really interesting when you can even just start to notice, like when you eat certain things, what feels good, like in your body versus, you read something about that and it says, oh, that's bad, but it's like, well, my body feels really good when I eat that particular food.
Yes.
I trust it.
I tell all of my clients that I may be an expert in functional nutrition, but they are definitely the expert on their body. So I don't override what they already know to be true, because they're the only one that can actually experience the communication that their body is giving them.
Right. And to actually feel into what they feel after eating something is important, and it's data that nobody else can gather. It's only you and your body.
Exactly.
Cool. Are there any other pieces you want to add about how stress and trauma and illness can affect digestion and absorption of food? I know that's probably a broad topic. But
it's broad, but I think it's so relevant. Back to the idea that when our body is in fight or flight, it's not in rest and digest. Rest, digest, and reproduce. So the reproduce is important because it does speak to the hormonal regulation of our body. If you're running from the lion, you don't have to eat, you don't have to rest, and you surely don't have to reproduce.
Right.
And it's really easy to like, ha ha ha, laugh that off. But if we truly look at our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight response, most of us are in that most of the time. We truly are, and you'll talk to people, and I'm definitely one of these people where you go, how was your vacation? Oh, it was great. About day 4, I started to relax. And then on day 7, I had to come home. Right.
Right. So you got a couple days.
Mm-hmm. And it goes back to that whole concept of not knowing that you're inflamed. Well, you also don't realize that you're not relaxed. You feel like, oh, relaxation is when I finally throw myself on the couch at night and watch TV or something, right?
Right.
So years of this, just consider years of every time you sit down to eat, or every time you eat in your car, every time you eat with, screaming children at your table, or, thinking of all these situations in my life. My body, most people's body, it's not in a state to break the food down properly and then to transport it from the intestines into the bloodstream. And that is truly a chemical and hormonal process that is happening. That if the body is not in a state of rest and digest, it does not produce all of those chemicals and hormones that we need for that process to happen. So you can be eating the most incredible diet, rich with all of the micronutrients and macronutrients you need, and losing most of it, excreting most of it, instead of breaking it down and absorbing it. And trauma affects that. It affects the vagal nerve that innervates the back of the brain and the heart and the lungs and the stomach and the intestines.
Right.
And medications affect this, and antibiotics over time because of the microbiome. The list is so long that by the time we get to 20 or 30 or 40 years old, when I'm doing health history with somebody, I'm starting at, okay, well, what was your mom's health like when you were in utero? Because all of the interactions and experiences in their life and health history of themselves and their parents are going to affect their ability to break the food down appropriately and absorb it. And that's a key factor in everything we're doing. It's not just about the food you're eating. Sometimes I'm supporting the function of the stomach and the digestive tract just as much as we're, eliminating or adding foods in. So we know that we're transporting.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's like we're eating good things, but our body doesn't even get the nutrition out of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Cool. Very important things, very important information that you're giving. So I hope people are taking notes.
Not getting too overwhelmed.
Yeah. We'll keep it hopefully manageable for people. And kind of on that note, what kind of guidance would you give people if they wanted to just start to think about diet as a factor in their health?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first thing to do is clean up your diet. I think of it as the food pyramid. Look at the food pyramid. Base, foundation, is you remove processed foods because you're going to take out a lot of things that are inflammatory in nature. And if you're on a whole food diet, eating things that don't come in the boxes and cans and bags and with additives, etc., and you notice, oh wait, I feel some shift. Okay, we're moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
From there, we move to, okay, maybe we need to try an elimination diet, as in you're going to eat a just baseline anti-inflammatory diet. You can look it up on the internet. What's an anti-inflammatory diet? You're going to take out wheat, sugar, eggs, dairy, corn. That's pretty much the typical anti-inflammatory diet. Even though there's individualization to all of this, if you notice, I feel a little better, you're moving in the right direction.
Right.
And from there, you have the opportunity to check in with your blood sugar, see if there's an issue there. If you notice heartburn, if you notice that you have fatigue after you eat, you have bloating after you eat, you have any discomfort in the abdomen, if you have constipation, which is not going at least once or twice a day in a well-formed stool, okay? If you have diarrhea, if you go to the bathroom too many times a day, more than 3 times a day, this is your body communicating with you. It's saying, something's not right, and it's either with the food or it's with the way you're digesting. Then you know that is the pathway you need to be on to start identifying the nutrition that's going to work for you. It can get overwhelming. That's why I work with people, is because I create that format for them, and I then translate the data about how their body is responding to decide what the next best step is, so they don't have to navigate that on their own.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be done if you're willing to do a lot of tracking, logging, paying close attention to your body's response, and don't forsake any symptom as a symptom. It is communication, it's information, it's data, right? And that's why, when I have a headache, I want to take that Advil so badly. But first, where's the headache coming from? Am I dehydrated? Am I tired? Is it sugar? Those sorts of things.
You're speaking my language. That's that was one of the episodes where I talked about, symptoms are intelligent communication from the body.
They really are.
They're not just, something just happened and now I just need to make it go away.
Yeah, you didn't get hit on the head by the unlucky stick. This is, illness in the world of chronic disease. It is a slow pathway of dysfunction that eventually is a disease. Mm-hmm. If we catch it in the process, we can turn it around. And every symptom is some information that helps us identify the best way to turn it around. Mm-hmm. And I think because inflammation is a trendy word right now, I think it's really important to know that the inflammatory process is the immune system's response to illness or injury, and that is a 4-part response. We will experience inflammation as redness, swelling, pain, or heat. Mm-hmm. Or, right? You can have all those things.
Yeah.
When I have somebody with eczema or psoriasis, that is in Chinese medicine heat.
Right.
That is communication. Something is off and it's telling us that information. So when we have any of those 4 symptoms of inflammation, we know that by the reduction of inflammation, we'll have a response in those systems, and that tells us we're on the right track. Keep doing that.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's some great advice of, how people can start to explore it on their own. And I definitely say it can be I can see how it can be overwhelming, and sometimes having someone on your team to help you do that so you don't just kind of give up by going, okay, I know I've heard people say, I don't even know what to eat if I was to do an anti-inflammatory elimination diet. What foods would I eat? Because we're so used to eating all those things.
Yes. And that is often for a lot of my clients, just the list that I'll give them of all the places they can still jump out of their car and run and get something versus having to prep and think of everything in their kitchen. That's the most important tool for them. Right. That they still can eat on the go. They can still have snacks. They know how to navigate this without having to face every meal with a big question mark. Because then you're going to probably make the wrong decision. You're like,
right.
Whatever.
What am I supposed to eat now? Oh, I give up. I'll just grab whatever's in the pantry and make it now.
Yeah. And I think it's important to know that this type of work is not linear. It does not just go in one direction. Sometimes there's 10 steps forward, 2 steps back. Mm-hmm. The body is constantly trying to recalibrate to new habits and new data. Mm-hmm. And that can be frustrating. And it's important to have somebody translate that for you as well, so you don't think that you've veered off the track and you don't know why.
Right. Yeah. It can be very confusing. I would imagine at certain points when it's like you're going through a shift or something and it's like, well, what does this mean now? Am I going the wrong direction? And sometimes it's like, no, it's just a recalibration.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate all this wonderful information that you've been sharing with the listeners. And
thanks for giving me a chance to talk about it. It's my favorite thing.
I know when we met, I was like, ooh, I could totally geek out with you on an interview. And I think it's such an important topic. I'm always mentioning nutrition, but it's not something that's my area of expertise. So I like people to have that information and also have resources of people who can support them in that process. So if people want to find you, where is the best way? How should they look you up?
Yeah, they can very easily access more information and my contact information on my website. My website is that going to be in the show notes, or do you want
it will be in the show notes, but you can mention it as well in case somebody's not looking at it.
Okay. My website is at the functional F as in Frank, X as in X-ray, so FX instead of RX. This is your functional nutrition prescription.com, functionalfx.com.
Cool. I love the name of it. It's catchy.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And that will definitely be the link will be in the show notes. So people who want to just look you up, read a little bit more about you, get in touch, just look for that in the show notes and you can link to there.
Great.
So thank you for taking the time today, and I hope all of the listeners really benefited from this. And until next time, everybody, I will see you in health.